Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I truly hope you're safe and healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of conversations about issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, I want to welcome back, actually, to the program, Jake Sullivan, former National Security Advisor, and more importantly, of course, a former non-resident senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment. Jake, I think I took your office, or at least the one you were using on a temporary basis when I first arrived in 2019. It's an honor and a privilege to welcome you back, and thanks so much for joining me again today.
Well, thank you for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, it'll be a good one, I think. Look, there are no rewind buttons on history. And I think it was William Faulkner who was writing in Requiem for a Nun who said that the past is never dead. It's not even past. So I'd like to divide our conversation basically into two parts. The first, looking back at your tenure as National Security Advisor in the Biden administration. And then second, looking forward maybe at the new administration, getting your thoughts on how the U.S. deals with a very different world. But I'd like to ask you a backstory question first. Call it the Sullivan backstory. When I interviewed Ken Burns a year or so ago, he spent considerable time on his mom, who died very young. And her death, Ken argues, really influenced his interest in things historical. And he wondered during the interview whether in examining the past, who he was really trying to connect with. So I just wonder, I'm wondering, how did Jake Sullivan from Minnesota, the center of the country, get enamored, interested, and influenced by not just foreign policy, Jake, but public service and the world beyond America's shores?
Well, for me, it was my family. My parents, I have 4 siblings, 3 brothers and a sister. And we had a globe in the middle of our kitchen table. And, dinners at our house were not a sit-down affair. It was just everybody goes in and grabs something because there were 7 of us and everybody had a whole lot of different things to do. Both my parents were working. But that globe was kind of the centerpiece to our conversations as I was growing up particularly in the 1980s, during the Cold War, during the time of Red Dawn and Rocky IV, Ronald Reagan. And we would spin that globe and we would talk about countries, we would talk about faraway places, and we'd talk about our place in the world at a moment in history when, we really were instilled with the idea that America could be a force for good, could stand up for the values of freedom and democracy and justice and truth. And that left a huge mark on me. And so when I went off to college, I knew what I wanted to study. I wanted to study international affairs and basically never looked back.
Yeah. I mean, so you did have a choice there. You ended up in law school, not the Foreign Service. What was that about?
Well, first, I believe deeply that a legal education helps develop the mind way beyond the law. It teaches you rigor. It teaches you how to question assumptions. It teaches you how to build an argument. And it also teaches you how to see the weaknesses and blind spots in your own perspective. And for me, that was really important. The idea that, one should not come at challenges and problems with certitude. You should come willing to acknowledge the strength of another person's argument, even if you disagree with it, and the weaknesses in your own, and do your best to continue to evolve and adapt as new information comes to light. I felt that my legal education and my years of clerking really allowed me to do that. The other thing about law school and about clerking that's really valuable is that you have to apply frameworks to new subject matter that you may not understand very well. I worked on cases involving very obscure industries that I knew nothing about, and yet was able to come to some understanding about the puts and takes in that industry through quick study and through being able to apply the basic rigorous framework of the law. And I feel like policy has a lot of that too. We're constantly presented with matters of first impression or an event somewhere in the world that we may not know that much about. We have to be able to bring to bear some tools to understand it, to ask tough questions about it, and ultimately to formulate a set of steps to respond to it. And I think a legal education also helps in that regard as well.
Yeah, I'm particularly struck by your notion of looking in the mirror, taking responsibility and examining your own argument. I mean, critically important, I would argue, for a successful foreign policy and the advancement of American national interests. So let me move on with before we get to the issues, Ukraine, China, Israel, Gaza, and then what you make of what you've seen over the last 6 weeks, 8 weeks in Washington. I want to ask you, when you became National Security Advisor, did you have a relatively coherent or cohesive view of the world? When we spoke in June 2020, you basically identified 3 issues. Now, not coincidentally, they figured prominently in the Biden administration's foreign policy. The first was that the key to American power was domestic resilience, defined by our economic strength, what you described as our values, a just society. That was one. Number 2 was how we manage and advance our alliances. And the 3 was what you referred to at the time. I think the formulation has changed. At the time, it was a competition with China without catastrophe. It just seems to me that those 3 issues, maybe there were more that figured prominently in the former president's approach to foreign policy, but did I leave anything out? Is that a fair representation?
I think it's a fair representation. It's about the foundations of American strength at home. It's about being flanked by allies and partners who can help force multiply for us. And I do believe that the long-term competition with China and managing it so that we are in a position of confidence in that competition while also avoiding a turn into conflict, those are going to be the defining features of whether the world is shaped in a way that advances American interests and values or whether it fails to do so. And of course, there are other issues that come along as we go, but those were the cornerstone of the approach that I brought to the job. And to me, they remain the cornerstone of what an effective U.S. foreign policy would look like going forward.
Yeah. Before we drill down on the 3 or 4 regional and functional issues, 2 more questions. One is the issue of U.S. leadership. The Constitution talks about perfecting a more perfect union. It doesn't really talk about perfecting, although the founders, I think, and their successors saw American values. It doesn't talk about perfecting a more perfect world. One of my former bosses, Madeleine Albright, and you know this well, borrowing an expression, I think, from Bill Clinton, talked about America as the indispensable power. Indispensability defined as without life, there's no water. So it is something so important that you cannot do without it. And that notion that we are indispensable, what's your view on that notion of indispensability?
Well, I wrote a piece in The Atlantic a few years ago where I took on this idea of indispensability. I understand what Secretary Albright was driving at. The idea that basically if America is not playing a critical role, if we're not in the room, if we're not mobilizing action to solve big challenges, either no one else will or someone else will who has a much darker or different vision for what the world should look like. And so I think at the core that makes sense. But what bothers me about the phrase indispensable is you're indispensable to someone else, not to yourself. It's an idea basically about delivering for others. And I believe that the core proposition of American foreign policy should fundamentally be about making lives better, safer, and easier, first and foremost, for the American people.
Yeah.
Now, I also believe in enlightened self-interest, which was a concept that Tocqueville talked about when he came and visited America. I think it's quintessentially an American idea, a positive sum mindset that says, yes, we look out for the American national interest, but there's nothing inconsistent between that and looking out for a larger common interest, because the two can reinforce one another. We can do better and others can do better.
Right.
And that positive sum notion, I think, should lie at the heart of American foreign policy. And it is the exact opposite of the way the current president is approaching things, which is totally zero sum. If someone else is gaining, we're losing. We should gain at the expense of other people, as opposed to we all do better when we all do better. So this to me is a really sharp distinction between the way the current president approaches things and the way I think the best of America, both Democrats and Republicans, have approached things.
Yeah, it's definitely a win-lose proposition for him. I just would note that de Gaulle quipped that the cemeteries of France were filled with indispensable people. So the reality is we have to find the balance of doing too much on one hand and not doing enough on the other. And that's very difficult in the sort of multipolar world that we now face. So again, on the issue of leadership, leadership is irrelevant without followers. And I use the term, someone said that a leader without followers is just a guy or a girl out for a walk. So the issue really becomes, how do you lead and attract others to associate with you? There's a wonderful line from, I think it's Shakespeare's Henry IV, a line Jack Kennedy loved. One character says to the other, "I can summon the spirits from the vasty deep." And the other one replies, "Well, so can any man. The question is, do they come when you call?" So the question here is, in this multipolar world, with a global South, with American credibility and values up for grabs, with our own domestic house in a fair amount of turmoil, democratic backsliding, how do you create addition in terms of people who are willing to associate with you rather than subtraction?
Well, look, it's very difficult to answer that question in a moment of such profound turmoil and upheaval in America's approach to the world. But what I can say is the hand we passed on to the Trump administration when we left on January 20th. That was a hand that involved a growing and dynamic transatlantic alliance, with us adding to NATO, two important and capable partners who became allies, Finland and Sweden. It involved a deepening relationship with our Asian allies, who we were working with, not just on hard security issues, but on technology, on clean energy, on infrastructure, and so much else. It involved a deepening relationship with India, the world's largest democracy, if an imperfect democracy. It involved new relationships with countries like Vietnam and Angola in Southeast Asia and in Africa. And all of that was built around the basic idea that the United States could bring a value proposition to the world in terms of our capacity to help mobilize countries to solve problems. And that, to me, is an available opportunity that we handed off to the Trump team that they could have built on. And what I have been struck by is, instead of trying to carry forward the momentum of addition, they are pursuing a policy of subtraction, starting with the transatlantic alliance in Europe, but also even closer to home with Canada. And that is a source of real concern to me.
All right. We'll get to that. One last question, and that is the issue of armchairing. You've said repeatedly that you don't want to be an armchair quarterback. And the basic reason is that you understand profoundly, frankly, I'd add my own voice to this, as do I, how unbelievably difficult it is to get anything done in government. And that's, I think I'll quote you here. You say, when facing a given hard policy decision, when you have imperfect people with imperfect information, dealing with imperfect choices in almost every context, I hear Niebuhr speaking here, you're going to get and come up with imperfect results. And the question that to me has been, it's proximate solutions, if we're lucky, to insoluble problems. So how do you're looking now at the new administration from outside, and you have a set of core beliefs and values. Would you still apply the same sort of standard and forbearance to this administration Imperfect people, imperfect choices, imperfect information, leading to imperfect results?
I think that is a fantastic question. And I'll just be honest with you, Aaron, it's something I'm grappling with right now. Because obviously there's a difference between, people struggling with difficult circumstances and doing their best on the one hand, and on the other hand, engaging in wildly destructive behavior that, is at odds with my view of the national interest and our core national character. So I can't treat those two things alike on the one hand. On the other hand, it has been less than 8 weeks since I walked out of the White House for the last time. And so, yes, I am a little bit tentative about springing right in there and opining in decisive and definitive ways, because I think there is a notion that somebody who's just left a job, having been subjected to armchair quarterbacks for 4 years, should give a new team the opportunity, to pursue their policies and to, be careful about when to come in with very sharp critiques. Right. So the way I am now thinking about balancing that is just to try to explain what I think is right, and therefore what the concerns I have about the current administration's approach are, without getting into scorecards or, fiery rhetoric or other things like that. And I have to say that what we have seen over these 7 weeks, both domestically and on the international stage, is of enormous concern. And the arrow seems to be pointing in the wrong direction on fundamental things, like the question of how we treat our friends and allies, like the question of adopting a zero-sum mindset where winning necessarily means crushing others, including our closest friends.
Right.
And like abandoning the basic notion that the United States can have a purposeful, positive sum attitude that delivers for the American people, but also supports, the broader common interest as well. So these are things that I do have to speak up and speak out about, but I have to do so with a sense of caution that it is early days, and we don't know how the story will be written on Ukraine or on China or on the Middle East or on other significant issues. And so speaking with some degree of caution and humility, I think, is extremely important.
And, I think your forbearance is greatly appreciated when it comes to foreign policy. I'm not entirely persuaded that it is deserved when it comes to what's happening here. We'll talk about the future of the American Republic, but I think, the founders talked about virtue, Jake. They talked about virtue in the presidency and virtue generally, virtue tethered to a broader conception of the national interest, of the common good, the community as a whole. And when you have a president who cannot turn the M and me upside down, so it becomes a W and we, you have a major problem, which is going to be played out not only in our domestic politics, where we're watching it every day, but in our foreign policy. Okay, so it's good transition in terms of imperfect, to say the least, results. 3 issues. Let's first talk about Afghanistan. You have said it's your biggest regret, not the strategic decision to withdraw, but the chaos and the seeming incompetence and humiliating position in which the United States was placed as a consequence of the process of that withdrawal. Any thoughts on how that could have been preempted and or avoided? I mean, not great intelligence, too quick to leave, poor planning. What happened?
Well, let me start by saying something I think that's very important, which is when you end a 20-year war with all of the decisions that had piled up over those 20 years, all of the dependencies and pathologies that were attendant to our policy in Afghanistan over 20 years, there was not going to be a straightforward, smooth way to exit. It was going to, almost by definition, be beset by challenges. There was the deep tragedy of the loss of 13 brave American service members. And I'm not saying that to, say, oh, there's nothing we could have done better. I will come to what I think we could have done better. But I do think it is really important for people to recognize that when you are faced with the question of continuing a war or ending a war is going to have a certain amount of challenge associated with it, and it did. That's point one. Point two, which I also think is really important, is many of the things people said at the time about that withdrawal with great confidence did not come to pass. They said it would crater our alliances and our standing with our friends in the world. Our alliances, I think, were at historic highs when we passed things off to the Trump administration, both in Europe and in Asia. They said we would leave American citizens behind. To my knowledge, we did not leave behind American citizens in Afghanistan. Anyone who wanted to leave, we availed themselves of an opportunity to leave. They said we wouldn't get Afghan allies out, the people who had worked with us. We have gotten more than 100,000 Afghan allies out to the United States, far beyond what anyone would have anticipated at the time. And critically, on the strategic decision, it is a good thing that we are not entering the 25th year of war in Afghanistan today. So the biggest thing that I think we could have done differently is that in the days leading up to the final withdrawal, we very much deferred to the Afghan government, who did not want us to be creating panic or a sense of imminent collapse. And we were deferential to that. And that was a lesson that, in fact, we should not do that. We should have moved earlier to indicate that we were going to have an evacuation and that we were concerned about deteriorating conditions in Afghanistan. We were trying to avoid the very thing that came to pass, which was a rapid collapse. So that was based on the best information we had at the time. It was a judgment we made, but in hindsight, we should have made a different judgment.
Yeah. I mean, you did say that, I think you were quoted as saying, if there are risks associated with any evacuation, the key is to move out early, even if it comes at a considerable risk of friction with the host government. Let's leave Afghanistan and move on to Ukraine. Look, again, with all due respect to the Bard, I think you summoned the spirits from the vasty deep, and people actually came. You built a cohesive, coherent coalition to oppose what was an effort on the part of Vladimir Putin to essentially extinguish Ukrainian sovereignty. You've cited the gains. Kyiv and Ukraine, well, at least for the most part anyway, are free and independent. The Russians have been thwarted in their initial aspirations. The conflict has not spread. World War III has not been triggered. NATO has expanded. All those things are true. But let's turn, and I think you've addressed these elsewhere. Let's turn to some of what your critics have said. Number one, you gave Ukraine enough to hold their own, not to lose, phrased negatively, but not enough to win. What say you about that?
Well, first, you moved pretty quickly past what to me is a description of quite a good policy, of which I'm very proud. Thwarted Russia, kept Ukraine free and independent, avoided World War III, no U.S. troops in combat, NATO bigger, stronger, and more cohesive than ever. If you had said at the start of the war, that's going to be the outcome, I would say, I'll take it. That's pretty darn good. Now, that doesn't mean that there has not been huge loss of life and tragedy and suffering. And that is something that, we worked at every single day in our time in office to try to get Ukraine what it needed. On the question of our provision of support to Ukraine, I would argue to you, number one, every single dollar that we could get from the Congress, we put into Ukraine. We didn't hold money back. We didn't choose to set aside a few $1 billion on the shelf and say, oh, we're not going to give them this extra stuff. So we took every single dollar appropriated and turned it over to Ukraine in the form of weapons and other support so that they could fight this. Also, we helped them build a significant force for a massive counteroffensive in 2023. That counteroffensive did not succeed. It didn't succeed not because the U.S. didn't give them enough equipment, but because defense in this war has proved much more formidable than offense in this war. And that's just a factor that the Russians have had to contend with, and it's a factor the Ukrainians have had to contend with. So I think and then finally, people talk about specific weapon systems as being the main reason why Ukraine didn't have what it needed to win. And I just want to identify a couple of them. One is F-16s. President Biden made the decision to support the provision of F-16s to Ukraine in May of 2023. We are now sitting here in March of 2025, and Ukraine has a dozen and a half planes and fewer pilots.
Right.
Not because we weren't prepared to provide them or support the provision of them, but because they don't have enough trained pilots to fly them. And those that are flying in defensive purposes. So the idea that F-16s were going to be a difference maker in the course of this conflict, I think has been basically disproven by events over the course of nearly 2 years. Similarly, on the Abrams tanks, we suggested at the time that it didn't make sense for them to get Abrams tanks because of the unique difficulty of maintaining them and having a supply line for them.
They wanted Bradleys, right?
Well, nobody really talked about Bradleys publicly. Everybody talked about Abrams. We talked about Bradleys, and we gave them Bradleys in significant numbers, and those Bradleys were really effective. They were not one of the hot weapon systems that was sort of much ballyhooed in the think tank community or the press. It was what our military guys said, that's what they need, and we gave that to them. On the Abrams, we gave them a number of Abrams. They've not come back and asked for more because they've recognized that Bradleys are the tank or the infantry fighting vehicle that is most useful. And that's another example of where I think a lot of the commentary in Washington, D.C. does not match up to the battlefield realities on the ground. So when I look back, do I think we could have done differently or moved faster with certain weapon systems? I mean, of course, I'm not here to argue we did everything perfectly all along in Ukraine by any stretch of the imagination. But I believe that if you look at the totality of what we did in Ukraine,
right,
the scope and scale and speed with which we moved things into that country, the support we gave in terms of intelligence, and the support that we gave in terms of their capacity to take a really big shot at a big offensive move, I feel that when history actually squares down and looks hard at this, the picture will be something that we can be quite proud of.
Right. Before we move on to China, let me ask you about the L word, because it's very much in vogue these days, and that is leverage. Was there unused leverage that we could have summoned and deployed against the Russians? I mean, I know I've heard this from the current administration. We've accomplished more in 3 weeks with respect to motivating the Europeans to stand up and do things than the previous administration accomplished with the Europeans in 3 years. I've heard that expressed. I mean, hindsight is everything, right? It's 2020. But on leverage with Russia and with the Europeans, could we have done more? Could the Biden administration, could America have done more?
Well, the answer to that question, I think, almost always is yes. We can always try to do more, but
wouldn't have been?
Just 2 points that I think are important to set the record straight. One, on the Europeans, they stepped up big on Ukraine, provided a massive amount of both capability and resources to Ukraine. They burden shared, and that was a result, in my view, of President Biden's leadership and the coalition he pulled together. And it was something that I think was unexpected and that was delivered. Two, when we took office after 4 years of the Trump administration, there were 9 allies who had reached 2% of GDP. When we left office, it was 23. So I'm not sure what this 3 weeks versus 3 years case is built on, to be honest with you. But we had countries, including a country like Germany, stepping up and finally hitting a 2% mark and taking a fundamentally different approach to their concept of defense contributions than they did before. So, I don't see that. Now, on the Russians, I think the piece of leverage that we came to right near the end of the administration was oil sanctions.
Yeah.
And we didn't impose them earlier. And a lot of people called for us to do so, understandably, because it's a huge source of revenue for Russia and would have put more of a squeeze on them economically than the squeeze we put on. Why didn't we do so? We didn't do so because these are the kinds of hard choices you have to make if you're sitting in the room. To take millions of barrels of Russian oil off the market would have driven up, especially in a supply constrained environment we were facing in 22 and 23, would have driven up the price of gas for middle-class families, working people in the United States to a point where, in our view, it would have imperiled our ability to sustain support for Ukraine over the long term. Now, when that supply environment changed, when the overall price of oil came down, we were in a position to then be able to impose oil sanctions on Russia. And that was a trade-off we had to make. Others may have made a different trade-off, but that is why it is that we chose the course that we did. And looking back, I think I would make the same choice, but I get why some people would say, hey, you should have moved earlier on oil sanctions.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and the hundreds of millions of dollars in Russian frozen assets, that's a more complicated issue. And it wasn't totally within our control, to be sure, to deploy those assets. Mostly they were in European and other nationals banks. Okay, let's move on to China. One basic question, and then you can answer with specifics. Do you think you got China right? Getting China right seems to me to be very, very difficult. U.S. policy seems to have toggled between looking at China as Satan's finger on earth, a country that wants to rule and take over the world on one hand. Well, no, but we can domesticate China on the other. We can make it a responsible player in the international system. What's the middle ground? Is it a Chinese version of the illiberal international order, where the Chinese want to rewrite the rules in a way that are more favorable to them? So what is your conception now, having worked on this issue for 4 years? And how would you judge Biden administration policy on China 4 years on?
Look, when we came in, I had basically 3 strategic premises for how we would approach the question of China. One, China is the only country in the world, and frankly in modern history, with the totality of attributes to challenge the United States economically, technologically, diplomatically, militarily, to try to displace the United States as the world's leading power, and the ambition to do so. 1. 2, we are in a decisive decade in that competition to ensure that that does not happen. And 3, no matter how this competition plays out, we are going to have to live alongside China as major powers in the world because they're not going anywhere. So those are the 3 strategic premises that we came with. And so we said, what, on the basis of those, should our policy be? Compete like hell while managing competition so that it doesn't tip over into conflict. And that means intense competition has to be paired with intense diplomacy. And that's what we did. And where did we leave things when we handed off to the Trump administration? When we came into office, the conventional wisdom was that China was going to surpass the United States economically by the end of this decade. Now the conventional wisdom is they may never surpass the United States. Right. The conventional wisdom was China's going to dominate AI. Now America's in the lead. China is competing vigorously, but I believe the U.S. has the best hand to be able to shape the future of artificial intelligence in a way where it works for us rather than against us. And finally, we were able to take these strong competitive actions with our allies and partners, improving our overall strategic position in that competition without creating an inexorable downward spiral into conflict. Yeah. So from my perspective, I think the approach that we took to China and the position we have put the United States in 2025 is looking back to where we were in 2021. I feel very good about our policy on China, which is part of a larger policy on Asia, which is part of a larger global strategy.
Right. A quick word on Taiwan before we move on to Israel, Gaza, and then the Trump administration. The balance between effective deterrence on one hand and not giving the Chinese pretexts, justification, or fears that somehow we're eroding the, quote, status quo. How do you maintain a balance going forward to avoid what you have argued and said war is not inevitable with China, nor is a forced military takeover by China of Taiwan?
Look, it starts with a strong foundation of deterrence. And deterrence, to me, has three elements to it. The first is that the U.S. military be postured in a way to have a credible deterrent in the Indo-Pacific. And we worked on that with our allies and partners, with Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and others. The second is supplying Taiwan with the self-defense articles they need to enhance their own capacity to defend the island. And, we did a lot of work over the course of the Biden administration on that front. And then the third is to indicate to the PRC that a war would also bring economic catastrophe for China. And that means working on a set of economic countermeasures and showing that we would be prepared to use them alongside friends. And so deterrence is really important. At the same time, it was important for us to indicate some basic principles. Number one, our one China policy has not changed. We are for the maintenance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and opposed to unilateral changes to the status quo from either side. And as President Biden said quite explicitly and several times, we do not support Taiwan independence. So you put together very strong deterrence with clear indications publicly and privately of a policy of maintaining peace and stability and opposing unilateral changes to the status quo. And that, I think, is how you can keep a policy going that is a little weird. The whole one China policy is strange. It's got all kinds of internal contradictions, but it works. It has worked for decades to keep the peace, and it can continue to keep the peace if we stay focused on the twin pieces of deterrence and diplomacy.
Right. Okay, let's move to Israel-Gaza. This is a complicated issue. We don't have a lot of time to talk about it. The last 15 months have proven to be incredibly painful and traumatic. October 7, the willful, indiscriminate killing of civilians, the mutilation, the sexual predation, the taking of hostages, Israel's response in an effort to prosecute its war against Hamas, an exponential rise of Palestinian civilian deaths, a catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, the margin, I suspect, for absorbing or tolerating, acquiescing in civilian casualties and causing them for the Israelis expanded significantly in the wake of October 7. Hamas embeds its assets in and around and below civilian structures and populations. You've said that, and it was clear, the president made a strategic decision in the beginning. He was going to support Israel. Emotionally, politically, it was Joe Biden. It's an example of how a president brings certain sensibilities and prejudgments to the Oval, which shape policy. You've said, though, that you will be constantly reflecting on whether there were particular decisions, or quote, particular decisions that you could have taken differently. And that process of reflection will continue. If I were to ask you to reflect now on three basic issues. One, did we do enough on humanity? I know what we did. Not a single shred of humanitarian assistance would have come into Gaza without Biden administration pressure. But did we do enough? Number one. Number two, could we have done more to pressure, alter Israel's own calculations with respect to civilian harm, deaths and injuries? And number three, could we have done anything more? I suspect not, to change Netanyahu's calculation on day after planning. Those are three core issues you're going to be reflecting on. Gaza is not going to go away for any and all of us. What would you reflect on as you go through this process of looking back on those issues?
So on the first issue, on humanitarian assistance and could we have done more, I think, again, as I've said to previous questions, the answer has to be yes. I mean, no, we couldn't have done more. Doesn't really, I think, pass the credibility test. But I do have to say, Aaron, having seen the evidence with respect to the humanitarian situation on the ground in Gaza after the ceasefire came in, one thing that emerged from my perspective, although I'm still waiting for more evidence on this front, is that there was a predicted and projected famine, widespread famine in Gaza. It was coming, it was imminent, it was nigh. And because of the United States, because we did push and prod and get more humanitarian assistance in, not enough by any stretch, but more, I do believe that we forestalled a massive famine in Gaza. And I don't think that that is a small thing. I think that is the product of US policy and US pushing. So not enough, but I think on humanitarian assistance, our capacity to shape Israeli behavior imperfectly was greater than it was on your second question, which is limiting civilian harm. And here, the real question that I think people rightly ask is, should you have done more to use the leverage of the provision of munitions to Israel, weapons to Israel, to get them to alter course? We did withhold 2,000-pound bombs because of the unique destructive capacity of those bombs. And actually, there's been very good analysis done of just how dropping those bombs in densely populated urban areas caused such catastrophic and massive damage.
Well, those shipments have now been resumed. And if the Israelis do, in fact, re-engage militarily, you're going to see just what impact they're going to have.
Yeah, I agree. We saw it in the early weeks of the war, and the shipments have been resumed, and now we'll see it again. Should we have done more on the withholding of weapons? Where I have been, but again, this is, these questions of how to use leverage are kind of, at the end of the day, so fundamental to so much of foreign policy. And there's no scientific formula. There's no mathematical equation you can apply. It's judgment. And my judgment is, unfortunately, Israel was not just fighting in Gaza. It was being attacked by Hezbollah. It was being attacked by the Houthis. It was being attacked by the militia groups in Iraq and Syria. And it was being attacked by Iran itself directly on multiple fronts. And so for me, the idea of saying, we're not giving you weapons in the midst of all of that was very difficult to square. And that's kind of where I am on this issue. It is difficult when a country, a friend, is at war, is under fire in so many ways from so many fronts, and then say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to squeeze you by cutting off your supply of the very things you need, to be able to prosecute a military campaign against all of these different fronts. So I think that's where I am. And then finally, on the day after planning, I mean, you have forgotten more about this than I know, about the challenge of a comprehensive or longer term lasting solution here, and how difficult it has been to get there over decades, and how much harder it is today for a variety of reasons. I wish that we could have come up with a formula or a set of steps that would have put us in a better position for day after. I do not believe that we have a clear approach to the day after. I still think it is elusive to this administration, and certainly this answer of depopulating Gaza, is not, from my point of view, a moral or wise thing to do. But I don't. That to me is more a regret of not having developed an effective strategy than it is, squeezing Netanyahu more. I think we were not able to put the puzzle pieces together on that. That has been elusive across multiple administrations. I think it remains elusive under this one.
I mean, I think that point is well taken. The reality is, Jake, we've rarely used leverage on, forget the Israelis, where there's a clear domestic political cost, and we don't use leverage on many or any of our friends. And I think that is again, you're watching something over the last 6 weeks, which is quite remarkable in that regard. I would argue it's ineffective and undermines our partners and our friends. Finally, we're really out of time, but I do want to get your sense of the challenges facing this republic domestically. You have nothing short of an assault on the very essence of liberal democratic government, liberal in the generic sense of the word, respect for rule of law, constitutionalism, the respect for individual rights. This is everything. Everything that is being done is fundamentally, I won't invoke your name, I'll invoke mine, runs against everything that I have tried to do, what previous administrations, Republican and Democrat, have tried to do. How are you processing all of this? And you are now going to go to the Kennedy School, the inaugural, you'll be a professor of practice, honor of the late Henry Kissinger. You're going to have an opportunity, and people will listen. They're not going to hit the delete button to what you have to say, both on domestic and foreign policy issues. How are you processing this now?
You know, I have to say that I have grave concern on the foreign policy front. But as I said, a lot is yet to be written. And so there's a lot more to try to understand about where this is all going. When it comes to the effort to degrade America's democracy and the major institutions of that democracy, which I believe is an effort underway, that is not grave concern. That is a 5-alarm fire. And we all have to speak up and stand and be counted, to say whether it's to do with the press or to do with the Congress and, you know, the spending of duly appropriated money, or the effort to chill law firms and litigation, or so many other examples that we've seen in just a few weeks. This is just an absolutely existential moment from my perspective for the United States not to end up going down a dark path. And I have to say that, and everybody has to say that. Now, what exactly is the end of this project? How should we characterize it? What are its attributes going to be 6 months from now, as opposed to, you know, just over the course of the first 6 weeks? I also think we have to continue to watch, adapt, understand, and, you know, be prepared to you know, make adjustments to our understanding of what's happening, because, you know, again, this has been such a short time so far. But yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly in what way I or others should be using our voice in this moment, but I do know and have conviction that we have to do so.
Yeah.
Particularly on these issues of the assault on the kind of foundations of our constitutional republic.
Yeah, I'll take you off the hook here for a minute, Jake. I do not understand why, at this moment of peril, that we have not heard from our former presidents, our former secretaries of state, our former secretaries of defense. I do not understand it. And maybe there's an explanation, but I know that you'll carry the ball for sure. And I know you will try to look back honestly, with clarity and integrity on the 4 years you spent in the Biden administration. And I hope at some point you'll come back as the Kissinger Professor of Practice at the Harvard Kennedy School, again on Carnegie Connects. Jake Sullivan, thanks for your honesty and your clarity. It means a lot.
Thank you, Aaron. I really appreciated the opportunity, and I look forward to doing it again at some point.
For sure. Take care.
Take care.